Hello, I'm Oriana Fox. Thank you for tuning in to Multiple O's, the spin-off podcast for my talk show, The O Show. The O Show is a live performance piece that mines the conventions of daytime TV talk shows for all that they're worth. It features artists and other experts who have no difficulty spilling the beans about their lives and opinions, especially when they defy norms and conventions. So if you're interested in candid confessions, nonconformity, creativity, and mental health, you've come to the right place. Hello, this is Oriana. I'm here today with Juliet Jacques, who is a writer and filmmaker whose work encompasses a mix of autobiography, fiction, socio-political critique, and cultural criticism. She's nothing if not prolific. I had my hands full preparing for this interview. She's written 3 books. The one she's most well known for is A Memoir. But her 3rd book, which is a collection of short stories called Variations, has come out this week. In addition, she's written for a slew of publications, including The Guardian, Sight and Sound, Freeze, New York Times, The Washington Post, Time Out, New Inquiry, The New Statesman, and many more. She writes on topics that reflect her expertise in and passion for literature and the arts more generally, trans politics and anti-capitalism, and of course, football. Juliet is perhaps best known for the blog she kept for The Guardian entitled A Transgender Journey from 2011 to 2012, which documented her gender reassignment. Through it and her subsequent memoir, she addressed both trans and cis non-trans audiences, aiming to change the terms of the debate around transness, which were dominated and perhaps still are by trans exclusionary feminists within the UK mainstream left-wing journalism, of which The Guardian itself was a key proponent. While to some extent, she had to give in to the demand that trans people, and perhaps trans women in particular, must express themselves through highly personal, autobiographical accounts. She always mixed self-disclosure with cultural and socio-political critique, which is why I very much wanted to speak with her. But more importantly, she's been able to go beyond typecasting in her career and craft a nuanced public persona, publishing, writing, and making films that go beyond both trans issues and the personal. For example, her blog with The New Statesman covers topics ranging from the value of opinion journalism in the face of Twitter to how capitalism affects art. Also, more recently, she founded and hosts the podcast Suite 212 on Resonance 104.4 FM, a radio program that looks at the arts in their social, cultural, political, and historical context. So thank you so much, Juliet, for taking the time to speak with me today.
Hi, yeah, it's nice to be here. Yeah.
Hopefully that wasn't too long of an introduction. It was I just wanted to do justice to, all that you've done, which is hard to do, as I said. You've been very prolific. Couldn't you make it easier on me by not being so prolific?
If you told me 10 years ago, I'd have written less,
So yeah, I found it interesting that your memoir begins with the kind of the post that's about your surgical transition, that you start with that. And you describe it as, quote, like a difficult cup final after some hard previous rounds, unquote. And as you put it in the epilogue to the memoir, it was not a hero's journey, but a bunch of hoops to jump through while working boring jobs. And I was interested in your choice to start at the kind of proverbial end. What was the reasoning behind that choice?
Well, a lot of conventional trans memoirs build up to surgery, and older trans memoirs in particular build up to surgery as the kind of moment of great change from male to female or vice versa. And this was critiqued by the great trans theorist Sandy Stone in the late 80s, early 90s in a really brilliant essay called The Empire Strikes Back, which was a big influence on my work. And in that essay, Stone talks about the need for trans writers to be honest about their experiences and not be silent as a way of kind of countering transphobia from conservative circles, from the old left, and from feminist quarters. Writing could be a way of countering those prejudices, but one of the things that transsexual writers had to do in order to do that was explore space between old ideas of male and female more openly and more honestly and more intelligently. And so when I was doing the transgender journey blog for The Guardian, obviously that had to be directly chronological because it was being written in something close to real time. I mean, it wasn't really real time because the transition process is so slow, but it was something close to it. And what was interesting for me about the blog format was that it wouldn't necessarily climax with surgery. You know, I might get halfway through transition and decide not to have lower surgery. I was fairly confident I wouldn't, but I might have decided not to complete transition at all, or detransition perhaps. But there was a tension there in that rolling blog format that made that interesting for me. I'd never really intended to write a memoir, and it was really publishers wanting me to do it. And this kind of awareness that I'd written myself into this sort of corner where I would have to write a memoir before I'd be allowed to really write anything else. So I decided to turn the book into a memoir and sort of didn't really quite know why I was doing it for a while, and discovered why I was doing it while doing it. I wanted to do it enough to keep doing it. So I think at a lower level, I had some reasons in mind why I was writing a memoir in book form, having already done this blog. But I wanted to take that imperative from Sandy Stone very seriously. You know, it's an imperative that impacted on all the other trans writers I'd been reading, people around in the 90s and 2000s, like Julia Serrano, Leslie Feinberg, Kate Bornstein, and others. And I thought one way to just play with that narrative would be to put the surgery at the start of the book, having already written the account of it, of course, for The Guardian. And you know, in the Guardian series, the surgery column was sort of the money shot. All of the previous columns had been about 900 words in length. Here, they let me write a 3,000-word post about a week in Charing Cross Hospital that you have to be in for, I think, 7 or maybe 8 days. And I put it in the memoir at the beginning with the Guardian's headline and the strap lines of the Guardian and whatever date it was published in 2012. To set up that this wasn't just a book about transition, but it was very much about how it's framed by the media and my own participation in the British media's coverage of trans issues. So by putting that surgery at the start, that set that up. And I had to win a battle with my editor. He didn't really like the fact that I was putting the kind of hook of the book at the beginning, because then after that, the narrative returns to something more or less chronological. The book cuts between personal chapters telling you what was happening in my life from the age of about 18 to 30, 31. And then that's interspersed with these bits of cultural criticism or socio-political commentary about trans politics, trans in the media, and in the arts. And then where the surgery should be in that structure, I replace it with another article I published online critiquing this idea of before and after photos, and this idea that there is a smooth, well, not a smooth, but like a cut in your life, like a definitive moment where you move from one gender to the other. And so that took the place of the surgery.
I get all of that, like completely, about the whole countering the before and after paradigm and how important that is. But I guess also it's like a kind of cliche question that trans like celebrities get, though, like about what's going on, you know, under their belts or whatever. Like it's just, and you like immediately answer that question kind of by doing that as well. So it's not, I don't know, it's like some people object to being asked,
well,
you know.
The thing with that question is no one ever actually wants to hear the answer.
Right. Really?
You know, if you tell them, they're instantly, you know, kind of revulsed or appalled somehow, and you just think, well, you asked, mate. I mean, one of the things I did in the Guardian series and in the memoir, and I think it was more interesting doing this in the Guardian series because the whole point of the Guardian series was to publish this material in a place where people might stumble across it and not necessarily be looking for it, but just, you know, log on to the Guardian website during a boring job or something. and see this article, and some of them would become interested in the journey and follow it from start to finish. Some of them would dip in and out of it, or even chance on it, or maybe even kind of hate read it. And in one of the posts just before the episode on the surgery, I include verbatim the leaflet that Charing Cross Hospital give you, saying this is what's going to happen to your body. So it's kind of trying to put the reader in my position to a very kind of deep level, and a much deeper level than people just sort of saying, like, you know, have you had the op? Would
Right,
maybe anticipate. So my strategy was to kind of over answer that question.
Right. Yeah, I think it's an interesting strategy, but also I think I just want to say, I don't know what this would lead to. It's not really a question; it's more like a comment. But just because you're 3 years younger than me, and you start writing from when you're 18, which is when I was 21, which is when I moved to the UK. So it was a strange kind of like parallax of like seeing the UK through and that time period through your eyes, and I had experienced it, the UK then as well. It was just kind of a weird. And
I hope
also,
you've enjoyed it more than I have. Yeah.
I've had my same kind of like struggles with boring, finding employment and all that sort of thing. Yeah, I could identify with you on multiple levels. And yeah, also like you went through your transition in 2012, which is when I had my first child in September, and it was like, and I remember, and all the Olympic stuff, like, so again, it was like this kind of like, oh, I was going through like a bodily, medicalized experience, like exactly the same time, exactly this cultural moment. It was just kind of, I don't know. So for me, I just felt like, I was able to kind of identify, maybe just because that through that generational lens, or like through this weird coincidences of.
Well, I had a really nice moment in one of my boring jobs that I talk about in the book when I worked for the NHS in Brighton, and I'd started having laser hair removal, and my facial hair used to be very dark and very thick. So at the start of transition, I was shaving twice a day, and hair removal was a nightmare for that reason, both financially and physically. But I told someone I worked with that I was doing this, and she said, look, I've got some hair on my top lip. I'd like to have it removed. Mm-hmm. And I said to her, yeah, be warned, it's really, really painful. And she just stopped and said, I've had 3 children. And I just laughed, thinking, oh, yeah, I'm sure that's incredibly painful, of course. And I was a couple of years away from surgery at that point. So I hadn't really started to think about how painful that would be. But yeah, there's some interesting analogies there for sure.
Yeah. Oh, also, I made a film about body hair removal, but anyway, that's a kind of another thing. But yeah, so then it was. I think it's really interesting the way you mix in like little anecdotes about your life into your cultural criticism. Like that, very recently, you've written something about Adam Curtis's new series of films, and in that you slip in this comment that you discovered that your clitoris worked while watching his earlier series, Century of the Self. So again, it was like this, oh, she really doesn't mind talking about this.
That's actually in the memoir as well, but it's a bit subtler in the memoir. It doesn't quite jump out as you as much.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, but it was just like, it's, it's just coming up within other contexts and stuff. It's not like anyway. So, yeah. So, because I've read Julia Serrano's Whipping Girl, and like, I just remember obviously being very curious about that and her section, because she talks about her orgasms, like kind of before and after surgery and stuff, and in detail of like the sensations of it, but nothing graphic about the anatomy. So I was just like always curious about that. Like I didn't understand. I mean, sorry, I don't know if this is like okay to talk about. It's just yeah. Anyway, so that was like, oh, okay. So there's a clitoris. Like you can have a clitoris. So that was kind of a moment for me of like my trans curiosity, like knowledge growth, due to your openness. Where am I going with this other than just telling you what I think?
This happens to me a lot, I'm very open in my writing, so people are very open with me. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, that's the thing about self-disclosure. It's well, the studies have shown, like the psychologists who studied it show that it unfolds in a dyadic effect. So if you disclose to people, they tend to disclose back. So yeah, have you ever had like a disclosure that you were like, whoa, I didn't need to know that?
I mean, not really. I mean, I'm not very squeamish about this, and I've disclosed a lot of very intimate stuff about myself. Really, a lot of the disclosures quite nice. I mean, you can, and a lot of it's done in a sort of quite intimate and private way. So I still get emails periodically off the back of the memoir, even the Guardian series 10 years ago now, either from trans people or friends or family of trans people saying that the writing helped them somehow and then sharing something of their own quote unquote journeys. And it's always really nice. I tend to keep my responses to them really brief because I don't have the time or the psychological energy to get into lots of like one-to-one relationships with strangers. So I always kind of write back to saying, hi, thanks for your message. I'm really glad to hear the book helped. That's exactly why I wrote it. All the best, Juliet.
Yeah.
But it's really nice to have that sort of connection. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's like kind of the response from, because you write about wanting to, change the terms of the debate. And do you feel like it, yeah, how do you feel about like the outcome of it in terms of that?
I mean, yeah, mixed, I think, as you can
Yeah.
probably imagine. I do wonder if I showed too much of my working. Growing up, I was always really into Brecht and post-punk music, and certain filmmakers like, say, Peter Watkins, who were very into both defamiliarization, but particularly demystification, and showing all of your working processes and kind of putting everything on the outside and thinking very carefully about your socio-political context and maybe talking about it. And I wonder if, by saying so clearly, I want to change the terms of debate, the response came from the sort of British media establishment, which I was explicitly trying to change. I made it very clear that I was launching a challenge to them. And their response was like, well, then we won't change the terms of debate. And in fact, we will double down on them. It took them some time to realise that. It took them several years. And I think they hit on that tactic by accident. I don't want to ascribe too much intelligence or even cunning to these people, really. But nonetheless, that was partly the outcome. But obviously, it's important to remember I was very much part of a trend, if not a movement. There were several other trans writers breaking into mainstream journalism around about the same time I was. C.N. Lester, Paris Lees, Ross Caveney was already around, of course. And there have been others since. But I think the thing that really, incensed a lot of people was the Time magazine's Tipping Point feature in 2014, which I think was pretty seismic in terms of trans representation in print media. The famous issue with Laverne Cox from Orange is the New Black on the cover. And this article saying trans rights have now reached a point where they can't be stopped or overturned. And I think quite a lot of people on the right took this as a challenge. So yeah, I think there are pitfalls, obviously, to being that open, but then at the same time explicitly saying I want to challenge the terms of the debate. Sometimes you do have to bring the subtext out into the open, and I think there probably are a lot of people who've read my work and some of the other trans writers who came up at the same time, and maybe there were more opportunities for people because what I did in the Guardian proved popular, and I think proved to editors that there was an interest in trans people talking about trans issues. A lot of people probably read that and think, yeah, actually, the terms on which these debates are being held are unpleasant and uninformative and just kind of useless as much as anything. And they are deliberately designed to stifle trans people, to put us on the defensive all of the time and stop us talking about the various social and political issues like sort of housing, employment, healthcare, let alone developing something positive like a trans culture. They're definitely aiming to do that.
So I think I've heard you say something about like Paris Lease being better at mainstream media than you, or yeah. Why do you think that is? Like, what is it?
I mean, by
about her?
mainstream media, I mean television.
Right.
Paris can go on, Good Morning Britain or Channel 4 News or whatever. She can talk to somebody like Piers Morgan, who, is quite avowedly, quote unquote, gender critical. I mean, I always think of Alan Partridge when I hear the phrase gender critical. And I also always think of Alan Partridge when I see Piers Morgan. But, Paris can talk in an intelligent but accessible way to people like that, can convey irritation, if not anger, without losing her temper or her dignity. I just think she comports herself very well, and of course, she always looks great. I have very rarely been invited into those sorts of spaces. I have once or twice, and I've always turned them down because I thought the terms of the debate were so stupid. And at the times I turned them down, I think was because I was still aspiring maybe to work a bit more in that sort of field, that overlap between broadsheet legacy media, the Guardian in particular, the New Statesman, Independent, places I was writing 6 or 7 years ago, and the overlap with BBC, Channel 4, Radio 4, Radio 3 discussion programmes. And what I would have wanted to do was to come on and just turn around the terms and put the spotlight on the interviewer. And that's a real no-no. If you do that once, you don't get invited back again.
Right.
And I wouldn't have been able to avoid either doing that or walking out, I think. And, also I like and I value length. I set up the space on Suite 212. So I'd have an hour a month or an hour a week at one point to talk in depth about an arts or cultural issue that interested me. I saw Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent at a pretty impressionable age. I was 21 and I was in Berlin. I had a free afternoon. It was on at a cinema there. And it's a 3-hour film, but Chomsky talks a lot about how these incredibly short segments are designed to stop you challenging the prevailing orthodoxy on a subject, because you can't overturn months, years, decades of manufacturing consent or consensus around a particular issue in 2 minutes, and especially not if the host is angrily interrupting you all the time, which is what happens to people on the left. So those slots are very, very difficult to navigate unless you can compress what you've got to say into something that's simple and emotionally affecting. And I think Paris is much better at that than I am. But, different people have different skills, and I think the more of us in the media there are, the better.
Yeah. So, and I know you use Twitter and you just came back to Facebook. Does being on Twitter help you with your brevity, or
I mean, to be honest, I use Twitter very differently now to how I used to. I joined Twitter quite grudgingly in 2010 after I'd done 2 or 3 of the Guardian columns, and I'd realised that pretty much everyone in journalism was on there. And if you were a very established journalist, if you were, I don't know, John Pilger or something, you probably don't need to be on Twitter. But anyone else, really, anyone kind of younger, it just made sense to be on there. And there were lots of good things about it the first time I used it. I made lots of interesting connections. I did probably 5 years worth of networking in 6 months. And I tried to use Twitter non-confrontationally the first time around. And, it became increasingly difficult as the issues around trans politics became more heated and sides really started to emerge. This kind of fragile liberal left truce sort of existed up until about 2013-14. I think the sort of liberals in the Labour Party and in the British media thought that the left had essentially gone away forever. A lot of people on the left had internalized their defeats and thought, okay, well, scrapping for bits of representation in broadly liberal political and media projects is the best we can do. And that consensus sort of flew apart between about 2014 and 15, really. And obviously the election of Jeremy Corbyn as the Labour leader, smashed that fragile truce wide open. And so I'm pathologically conflict averse. I really, really do not like direct conflict with people. I can't really deal with it. So I found Twitter harder and harder in that respect. And so I came off it for quite a long time. But then when I did the Suite 212, I came back on with the radio program, which gave me some more anonymity. And I sort of realized that I didn't really need to be building up a name for myself anymore. So I didn't need to use Twitter in that way. I came back on, I think, on my own account in 2019 because I stopped doing the radio show for a while. And actually, I'd kind of found Twitter quite a useful place to organise politically with comrades and to talk to friends. I'm still quite conflict averse on there. I don't really get into direct conflicts, but I'm very much on a side. And the side is, this kind of like younger, more left-wing, pro-trans. Those are kind of my people. And I mean, I actually have the words comrades only in my bio at one point, making it very, very clear that I was absolutely not interested in arguing with transphobes or with kind of centre-right political opponents of mine. So I actually find Twitter sort of more enjoyable in that respect, although I've had to turn off everything to do with the Labour Party because it just drives me crazy. And I mean, I came back on Facebook recently. I was off there for about 3 or 4 months. And I've just come back on broadly to promote my book, and I'll probably come off it again once that's done. I really find Facebook very boring, actually, more than anything. But also with Facebook, there was an interesting problem that I think speaks to, your interests and what we're talking about, which is that I've been on Facebook, I think, since 2007. And of course, back then, like, no one knew who I was. It was pre-transition. In fact, I was living in Brighton. I was writing and publishing, but for a tiny film magazine that no one read, mostly. And then, of course, I changed my name on there in 2009 when I came out as transsexual and started transitioning. And then started writing for The Guardian about a year later. And so, of course, on Facebook, lots of people I then didn't know wanted to be friends with me. And I had a real problem with Facebook determining whether it was a private or public space and not knowing what to say on there. And so I would post things aimed at old friends and talking to them in the register, I'd always talk to them. And then these strangers would kind of pipe up, attacking my friends or attacking me for talking inappropriately about something. And I kind of thought, no, you two people weren't supposed to meet.
Right.
And there's a reason why you haven't. And then I'd have the sort of inverse problem, which is that after a while of that, I would start using Facebook as a way of talking to this kind of wider audience that I built up, where I wasn't quite sure who they were, and of trying to kind of position myself in a certain way on there. And then, of course, old friends would kind of think it was sort of insincere, would be kind of resentful of it maybe, or just think I was getting like big-headed, which definitely happened. If you do something that's quite successful quite quickly and more successful than you expected, that can happen. It did for a while. I like to think I made a conscious effort to be aware of that and to kind of deal with it. And it just became easier to just not use it. And the thing with Twitter is, like, I know it's entirely public. And even though, like I said, I actually kind of use it to talk more to friends and people on my side, I don't put anything on there that I wouldn't want a stranger to see. And I'm actually, having written the Guardian series and the memoir, I think I give very little away about my personal life now. I mean, I've always had a policy of like keeping my love life off the internet. And there's, really since I finished the memoir and published it in 2015, I made a real pivot away from very personal writing. And that's, I still write things where I am in the story, and I do that quite a lot, but I am not the story.
Right. And and obviously the new book is fiction. So, and I've read your article, which is about trans memoirs and kind of the conventions of that and the benefits of kind of embracing and fighting against them at the same time. But yeah, you write about fiction being a kind of positive outlet of like being able to talk about oneself without the risks of labeling it as yourself. But it's and as you're saying now, you don't reveal things about your personal life or your sex life, or was it romantic life? What was the word?
Yeah, sort of love life. Yeah,
love life. So like, does the fiction allow an outlet for that? Is it partly to do with like the ethics of like another person? And, you know, it's not just about what, you know, yourself revealing personal things, but it also entails revealing personal things about another person if you were to write it.
I mean,
or is it just a desire for privacy for yourself as well?
There's a few questions there, I think. I'll try and unpick them a bit. I mean, in terms of just not writing about my love life, yeah, I mean, it is partly other people. I mean, with the memoir in particular, I had to make lots of decisions about who I wrote about and how, and who counted as, you know, a public person and who was a private person. And that does kind of cast the game of being in the commentariat kind of like a war. You know, there are soldiers and civilians, and, you know, try and keep them separate. But, you know, with the memoir, obviously I had to write a lot about being in the media, and I kind of came to the conclusion that if I wrote about any public figure quoting things they'd said on a public forum, whether that was a Guardian opinion piece or Twitter, that was completely fair game. So there were a couple of like older sort of gender critical, quote unquote, feminist journalists who I quoted saying things that I think probably don't reflect very well on them. And my take on it was like, well, you shouldn't have said it, so should you? So I wouldn't have taken anything off their Facebook pages, for example. I don't think that would have been fair game.
Right.
But, you know, Twitter, I think, is fine, public forum. And then there are, of course, like private people, like people I used to work with. So in those cases, I would often give them a pseudonym or just a first name, so they wouldn't be readily identifiable. And I think that's okay as well. Like, ethically, I was kind of fine with that. There was one person I wrote about an old job in Brighton who I think I just gave him his first name, but it was a huge company and you wouldn't have just identified him from that. But also the stuff I quoted from him was him being a dick. So, you know, I think if he'd come back to me and said, why did you publish that stuff I did? My line would be like, well, you shouldn't have been such a twat, should you? Because he knew it at the time. I actually did bump into him a while ago, and it was actually quite a nice conversation that made me feel a bit bad about it. But anyway, so there's that issue about who to write about and how you navigate that. And of course, lovers makes that very difficult. And actually, I haven't really been in a lot of long-term relationships. I think partly because I've been so focused on writing and transition, and that's actually something that's only really started coming into my life since I finished writing the memoir. Not since I finished publishing it, but since I finished writing it. So there hasn't really actually been called to write about that because, like I said, I'm not really doing that kind of writing anymore. In terms of pivoting to fiction, I mean, it was what I always wanted to do. You know, in the memoir, I explicitly talk about trying to write this volume of short stories about trans people, and that being the project I'm more passionate about. And it's interesting, a few of the kind of reviews of the memoir, not in mainstream publications, but online, you know, pick up on saying with the memoir, this comes across as a book that Juliet didn't really want to write. And I didn't really, and I've kind of explicitly said that in this interview already. And I kind of, what I did was made a virtue out of that. So, you know, use the fact I didn't really want to write it to criticize the sort of circumstances that force trans and non-binary writers to write about their journeys and their bodies and criticize this kind of market and the presumptions of editorial and publishing gatekeepers, and sort of built that into the narrative. And then of course included that epilogue with Sheila Hetty, who, you know, writes autofiction very interestingly. There's a reason why I chose Sheila, and that was the reason. But this epilogue, which is a way of kind of simultaneously prolonging the narrative, so saying, look, my life didn't just end with the surgery, which is kind of where my editor wanted the book to end originally, and I talked him into this epilogue. So a way of saying my life just didn't end with the surgery, but without just saying here's a bunch of stuff I did next and ending at this kind of arbitrary point, but also critiquing some of the narrative conventions and setting up fiction as the next project. And fiction, I think, you know, you tell a big lie, which is, you know, this is not true. You are not to read this as truth or fact, but it can be truthful. And I think if I were to write something more auto-fictional, then that would have been a really interesting blurring of that line. There's a novel from the early 90s by a writer, Leslie Feinberg, called Stone Butch Blues, which is subtitled a novel. And of course, by subtitling it a novel, it's flagging up the fact that it both is and isn't a novel. And of course, I stole that technique for Trans, a memoir. But Feinberg several occasions sort of blurred the line about how autobiographical it was, and at some point said in interviews, no, you're not to read this as fiction, you're not to read it as autobiography. And then at other points in correspondence or other statements said, look, actually, there's a lot of details from my life here, but by writing it as fiction, I avoid this obligation to, as Feinberg put it, strip or be stripped.
Yeah.
But Variations isn't really doing that because it's historical fiction. There's one or two stories, I think, that draw a bit more explicitly from my own life. So there's a story set in Manchester in the 80s. But the central character it cuts between 1988 and 2000, which are the two big protests against what became Section 28, the law that Thatcher put through, that banned the promotion of homosexuality in schools and public libraries and so forth. It's kind of attack on local government, which leveraged this homophobia, and obviously in doing so condemned a generation of school children, me especially, because my schooling kind of started in 1986 when the clause was introduced, and I graduated from university in 2003, which is the year the clause was abolished. Right. But it was intended to stop children learning about gender variance, sexual diversity, and of course it's pre-internet, so you can kind of control information in that way. But the central character in that story is called Never Going Underground. As an undergrad, is a pre-transition kind of proto-trans woman, and then 12 years later is an out transsexual woman who has transitioned, and goes to University of Manchester like I did. I put her in the same halls of residence that I was in, and there are some similar experiences. There's a moment in the story where she has this quite laddish flatmates, and like one of them falls through her door, which is left closed but not locked, while she's having sex, and like that happened to me. I mean, not while I was having sex, but I was in my room with a friend, and my mate Simon just like was hammered and just like fell through the door and then like got up and said, oh, sorry about that. So I kind of stole that moment. So that story that's the character that's probably got the most in common with me. But even so, that story is far more invention than not, and it's set at a different time. So I think these stories, it's more that they take on, obviously my cultural interests, my political position to some extent is in there. My take on sort of trans history and my take on Britain as a country and what it's like. Of course, all of those things come through the text, but they're not auto fiction.
Right. So your desire to write fiction was kind of born out of an interest in literature and creative writing, and not necessarily like
and the
a way of doing autobiography without the risk.
Yeah, and the fact that there isn't really much trans literature. It's only really starting to emerge now, and particularly in the US. Tori Peters recently getting longlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction. Agwake Emezi, who I think is Nigerian, but I think they're based in the US. People like Casey Plett and Imogen Binney, who were publishing on Topside a few years ago. And more recently, Andrea Lawler and Geordie Rosenberg. So you're getting this emergence of like a really formally interesting and diverse trans and non-binary literature in North America, in the US and Canada. And there's not been an awful lot here as yet. You've had like Ross Cave and his novel Tiny Pieces of Skull, which was written in 1988, but I think only published in 2015. There's arguments about The Well of Loneliness, published in 1928 by Radcliffe Hall, which is sort of canonically taken as a lesbian novel, but the central character calls himself Stephen throughout, and talks a lot about feeling more like a man or wanting to take on a sort of male traditional gender role, and identifies as an invert, which is this sort of late Victorian, early 20th century identity that precedes and sort of elides that difference in gender variance and sexual diversity. So there's some argument about that, but there's very little British trans literature. There's quite a good trans poetry scene, actually. There's people like Nat Rahar and Verity Spot, Jay Bernard, who won the I think it's a Ted Hughes Award a year or two ago. So there's a really interesting emerging trans poetry scene, but in terms of prose, fiction prose, there's not much yet. And I actually first conceived this volume of short stories, I think in 2003. And I had a go at writing it in my mid-2000s. Well, in the mid-2000s. And was very influenced by Raina Heppenstall, who I published a book on, B.S. Johnson, Anne Quinn, these sort of quite formally experimental British 1960s novelists who'd been quite marginalised at the time and subsequently more or less forgotten, were starting to be reconsidered at that point. And these French writers like kind of Nathalie Sarraute, Alain Robbe-Grillet, Claude Simon, Marguerite Duras, the Nouveau Roman group, who were doing some quite interesting things with first-person perspectives in novels and with form. But the sort of framework I needed to write these stories didn't really exist yet. The kind of theoretical transgender studies movement that followed on from Sandy Stone either didn't really exist yet or wasn't very accessible to me. So there was some interesting stuff that happened in the 90s that I didn't yet really quite know about or hadn't really fully consumed. But, Julia Serrano hadn't published Whipping Girl yet. Transgender Studies Quarterly didn't exist yet. There were a lot of, over the last 10 years, I think, again, primarily in North America, advances in trans theoretical writing that have made the literature possible. I think, following on from the memoir of the 20th century, there was then this theory in the late 20th, early 21st century, and now there's an emergence of trans fiction. But at the time, it was not really possible to write the book I wanted to write, partly because of that, but partly my own lack of life experience. I mean, in the short stories and variations coming out in June, for example, the opening story is set in 1846. It's called A Night at the Theatre. And the central character is a dressmaker known as James, who has moved to London, rapidly industrializing city, or already industrialized really, from a village in Sussex, very near where I grew up, and wants to go to the theatre dressed as a woman just for one night, just to see what it's like, and knows that this risks arrest and public humiliation. There isn't really a law that cross-dressers could be charged under, apart from sort of breach of the peace or something like that. But nonetheless, it's a huge risk in all sorts of ways. And of course, me growing up in the 90s and 2000s, going out as a woman, I didn't have the risk of arrest. I probably wouldn't have lost jobs over it, or at least not explicitly so. But, there was always the risk of being beaten up or, ostracized by friends and family. And so, of course, I drew on my own experiences in transition, where the character goes out as a woman in 1840s clothes. You can kind of maybe imagine what that's like. That the character is new to wearing and isn't really that familiar with how they feel on the body and how to move in them and things, and so it's constantly worried about passing. And it was interesting to be able to transpose my early 21st century anxieties about that back onto someone from the early Victorian period. But that took a lot of living to be able to do that, as well as kind of reading and thinking,
That makes sense. And that's interesting to get kind of an insight into the new stuff. Obviously, you did it the hard way of writing this memoir you didn't want to write. But do you think it's easier now, for all those new trans fiction writers? I
think it probably is. I think we're probably past the point. I think in the US, we've been past this point for a while, where trans writers, I think, aren't obliged to write autobiographically anymore. And a big part of my project was to smash through that. And of course, I talk about this as something of a burden. It wasn't really, I enjoyed a lot of it. It was often quite fraught, but, worth doing. And I've had an awful lot of, praise and adulation, opportunity come up. I've traveled all over the world as a result of that writing. So I wouldn't for a second kind of complain about doing it. And I did choose to do it. No one did make me do it. So, but, nonetheless, I did want to kind of open up the discourse. And I think in Britain, what we're seeing more of is the more sort of trans theoretical writing coming through, and particularly that sort of trans non-fiction writing that is an outgrowth of journalism. And in Britain, it's probably true elsewhere as well, but in Britain, there's a pretty close relationship in non-fiction publishing between journalism and book publishing. And, this isn't always a good thing. I was in Foyles recently and just saw a table just full of books by sort of journalists and politicians who I don't particularly rate morally or intellectually. But
they've been given book deals.
Yeah, probably very, very well remunerated book deals, and they've written, things that are designed to be given as presents or whatever, and they're pretty disposable and they'll disappear in a year or two. There's a very funny bit in an Ian Duncan Smith's parody of one of the Splitting Image sketches where Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings call up David Aranovich to ask him if he's got any jokes for the new series of Splitting Image because they don't have any. And he just holds up like a litany of just like terrible centrist politicians and journalist books. And Johnson and Cummings just kind of just tell him to go away because these books are just useless to them. So there's loads of that. But more positively, I think for trans people like Paris Lee, Sean Fay, Munro Bergdorf and others have got books coming out that are to some extent extensions of their journalistic projects in the same way that mine was.
Yeah. But you've been able to like pivot to fiction, but also to writing about art and other subjects.
Yeah.
So in a way, like I feel like you're your own success story.
I mean, that was kind of, but that was always parallel practice. I mean, the kind of writer
you do it in the book as well.
The kind of writer I really wanted to be when I was in my early to mid 20s, and just kind of writing what I wanted without thinking too much about the market, was doing exactly that, was writing about like experimental literature and film, was writing short stories, some of which had a trans theme, some of which didn't. I didn't publish much of this. Was trying to write screenplays and theatre plays. So I feel that, the sort of the directly autobiographical trans writing was like a phase I went through, partly for aesthetic reasons, but mainly for political reasons, partly for career reasons as well, let's be honest. And now I've kind of had to it's taken me quite a long while, I think I underestimated how the size of the turning circle, and that once you've kind of established yourself in the public eye, and particularly the eyes of editors and commissioners, that you are the person who writes personally about trans stuff and at a push about trans politics. It took a long time to sort of steer the ship back round so that was part of my practice, but not the whole of my practice. And Twitter was quite helpful for that, actually. I mean, particularly when I was doing the Guardian series, I did get typecast, obviously, as this kind of transgender journalist in a way that I hadn't quite been ready for. And Ros Caveney is an older trans writer. I was at an event with her once, I think 2011, we were talking about trans writing, and C.N. Lester was on the panel as well. And Ros was talking about her practice and said, look, I just did everything I could to not become the transgender journalist. And I just sat there and folded my arms, said, don't worry, that job's taken now. And Ross just sort of looked at me with a smile and said, like, I know that job's taken. I'm very glad that it's taken. And, I did feel like a bit of a mug. But have pivoted away from it. And I think occupying that role in the discourse, even then, was incredibly difficult and fraught and exhausting. I think probably at that time it was more fraught and exhausting because of the demands of our own side. And people were obviously... trans people very concerned about media representations. There'd been so little of it, and what there had been so awful and damaging. So, any trans journalist who put their head above the parapet, it was taken very seriously, and what we did really mattered to people. I think now there's a slightly different problem, which I actually paradoxically find easier to navigate, which is that there's a lot more trans representations. There's a lot less burden of representation on individual trans writers and journalists. So in that way, it's easier, and unless you are politically like completely retrograde, then you can get away with a lot more.
Like, what can you get away with? What do you mean by that?
I mean, I think you can sort of maybe challenge some orthodoxies of sort of trans politics, or you can be a bit more messy in the kind of types of people you represent. I mean, Tori Peters' Detransition Baby is a good example. I mean, that has got some trans people's backs up, I think, because it, portrays trans people as, in some way, or portrays the characters as sort of duplicitous in some ways, or, sexually quite experimental, and so forth, or motivated by the wrong things. And I think if we'd published that book 10 years ago, the characters would have been taken much more as representative of all trans people, and you would have had a lot of trans people just say, look, no, you can't portray us like this. But I think now probably there are enough like trans people and works of like trans literature, and particularly television and film, that there's not so much burden of representation on individual people and their work. Of course, the problem you have now is that the kind of anti-trans feminists are very well organized. I I think, overrepresented in mainstream media, but they have a very vocal presence in mainstream media. They're increasingly using the law, actually, and increasingly interested in legislation to suppress us. So you're writing in the face of, and again, this stuff was always there, and indeed I was writing in the face of it and writing against it 10 or 15 years ago. But this stuff is...
Yeah, I wasn't aware of it happening so much then.
Well, exactly,
I'm very aware of it now, so it's interesting that it was like...
I mean, it was definitely there, but again, I talked earlier about the kind of liberals thinking that the battles against the left were won and then getting very, very angry when they found that they weren't and had to fight them again. And the same thing kind of happened here. I mean, trans exclusionary feminism was very much the orthodoxy of The Guardian in the mid-2000s. I write about this in the memoir. And then it was sort of people like, well, me and lots of others challenging it that kind of forced them to raise the stakes, really. And, that's kind of got us to the position that we're in now. I mean, I don't really want to talk about them a lot because it's boring. And a big part of their project is to force us to...
And there's so much said about it.
Yeah, it's a lot said about it. And a big part of their project is to force us
to talk about
onto their agenda. And one reason to do variations, I think, was to, is a way of raising the stakes of my project, of changing that agenda and saying, well, okay, look, I did this in comment journalism and you people responded by basically making places like The Guardian and The New Statesman a hostile environment for trans writers. I'm going to write this fiction book and, you can respond to that how you like. I mean, I probably personally will ignore them, but... I guess they've got their preemptive response in because J.K. Rowling has done that 900-page rewrite of the Brian De Palma film Dressed to Kill. But no one's read all of that. I don't think even J.K. Rowling's read all of it. Why would she?
So this story you're telling me about when was it set again? The
first
40s?
One.
Yeah.
1846.
1846. So is it about sort of raising awareness that like trans people have always been around? And
that became a big part of it because, like I said, I'd always wanted to write a volume of short stories about trans people, and the idea was always, back in the early to mid 2000s when I was kind of first conceiving this project, that they would use a variety of different literary forms. I was very interested in modernist literature, formal experimentation, but I didn't always have this idea that it would specifically tell a history of trans and non-binary people in Britain. That came later, and that came from meeting journalists after I started doing the Guardian series and being really quite shocked that people who wrote a lot about trans issues, like partly from a kind of gender critical perspective. So I really can't say the words gender critical without thinking of Alan Partridge calling himself a homo skeptic. It really throws me every time I say it. But meeting these journalists who were quite hostile to us, really. And finding they would say things about the process of transition, the gender identity clinics in particular. I was like, no, you've kind of either you're completely wrong or you've got your facts wrong, but you've completely missed the point. And that was really what put me on to thinking, well, actually, no, there needs to be a history of trans and non-binary people in Britain. And in the end, I decided it would be more interesting to write it as fiction. There were lots of reasons for that, but one was this historical problem. I studied history, I did a history degree, and then my postgrad studies were literature and visual culture and then creative writing. So those were my kind of interests. And I found that postmodern approaches to history have often said you can't transpose identities onto people who preceded them. So, you can't speak of, say, the Chevalier d'Eon, who was a male-to-female cross-dresser who lived almost exclusively as a woman for large parts of their life. You can't transpose a trans identity onto someone like that. And that's obviously a big problem for writing a kind of non-fiction trans history was, which people do you include under this banner and why, and how much time do you devote to explaining them? I think another problem at the moment is that there's so little trans history written that I think for a writer like me, who is, yes, like a transsexual woman, but is also middle class, white, and so for otherwise, reasonably privileged, I don't think it would be good for me to kind of say, like, I am delivering the definitive history of trans people in Britain. I think actually, like, authored, sort of edited volumes are a better way to go at the moment. And Christine Burns edited a volume like that a few years ago called Trans Britain. And I think there's a lot more to be said, and, you know, really opening up the discourse actually for lots of different trans histories, you know, bringing like issues around class and race and, you know, access to medical services, as well as just kind of saying here are the legal issues and the battles that have been fought and so forth. But so there's that postmodern approach to history that says you can't transpose these identities onto people that preceded them, which, coupled with straightforward prejudice that, you know, has always tried to deny the existence of a trans history because it doesn't want trans people to feel like anything different to a fairly difficult present for us has been possible, but also doesn't acknowledge that there have been huge social and legislative efforts in the past, and particularly in the Victorian period, to legislate against public cross-dressing of any sort. You know, so they don't acknowledge that huge efforts have been made to stymie us in the past, and one reason why we don't have a history is because we've not been really allowed one.
Right.
And again, using fiction, you sidestep that problem of kind of transposing identities. And like I said, I could use my experience to look back at people. So again, to use that first story, A Night at the Theatre, as an example, there's a book by a gay historian called H.G. Cox called Nameless Offences, about homosexuality in Victorian Britain. And in it, he talks a lot about how industrial cities let people escape the kind of bonds of feudal societies, move to a city, have relative anonymity, and try to do things like publicly cross-dress. And of course, at the same time, you get the in London, you get the establishment of the Metropolitan Police in 1829. The first ever Metropolitan Police badge holder is fired after 4 hours for being drunk on the job, and sadly, that didn't close the force down. They're still with us. But you know, the police were formed partly to deal with, you know, public anxieties about vice in the Victorian industrial city. And indeed, there's a group called the Society for the Suppression of Vice around at this time. And I bet they were a fucking joy to be around. But can't imagine how much fun you would have talking to one of those guys. But you know, they started regulating gender presentation. And then there are a couple of high-profile court cases, really high-profile one of two cross-dressers called Bolton and Park in 1871. There were laws against sodomy at this point, but not much else. And so Bolton and Park are tried for cross-dressing because they're suspected of being queers, basically. Again, homosexual doesn't exist as a term yet. But, you know, they're suspected of being sodomites. You know, there's only terms for behaviours at this point, not really identities. We could talk about Foucault's history of sexuality, but we've been going a while now, so maybe we're all part of that. But, you know, Bolton and Park are tried. And the Metropolitan Police subject them to a medical examination to determine whether or not they've had anal sex, which of course doesn't, you know, is inconclusive. And the police, the judge actually criticised the police in court for this, saying, look, you've like wildly outstepped your jurisdiction by doing this. It's a really appalling thing for you to have done. So, you know, a Victorian judge sides with these two cross-dressers against the Metropolitan Police. Like, that's how fucking awful they were.
Some justice in the world.
Well, I mean, so basically the judge, in summing up in the Bolton and Park case, it takes a year for them to reach trial. The trial goes on for like nearly a week. And the judge, in summing up, basically says, look, we really want to do you for something here, but we've checked the rule book and we can't find anything, so we're going to have to let you go. And so they get this like dishonourable discharge. And Ernest Bolton, Stella Bolton, goes to America and like launches a career as a drag queen there, which comes up in the second story in my book, set in the late Victorian period. And it's set after 1885, which is when the law against gross indecency is passed, partly in a response to Bolton and Park. Which, of course, you know, makes any act of gross indecency, public or private, between two adult men imprisonable with 2 years of hard labour. And, of course, this is what does for Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde is like obsessed with Bolton and Park, and he thinks he can use the same tactics if he gets in trouble. He thinks he can use the same tactics that worked in court for Bolton and Park, which is sort of saying, look, you know, this was all part of my creative work. It's not who I actually am. All of this, and of course, for Bolton and Park, that works because they're just being tried for sodomy. Whereas Oscar Wilde, it doesn't work because the climate has changed, and actually his works are really used against him in court. And so the second story in the volume is set around the Oscar Wilde trial, and it kind of brings out all these trans subtexts of the Wilde trial and of that kind of period of literature and sexology, which quite closely interlinked at the time. And it kind of draws them out by inventing a new character who is designed to pull all of those things out. But there was an act of invention there needed to kind of reveal the truth of that society from a trans perspective, I think. So it goes back to that question about kind of facts and truthfulness. And there's this invention that lets all the kind of facts and the kind of overall truth cohere around it. So I think that's really interesting. I've gone a very long way from the original question. Indeed, I've forgotten what it was.
I don't know what it is either. I was thinking that. I was like, I have no idea what my question was. But what you said just now, like, really touches upon, like, maybe an affinity or just like a reason for coalition between different kind of factions of identity, or like between anti-racism and transness or trans politics. So yeah, I know that I just something that you said recently, like on a podcast, was let me find it. You think we've got to keep LGB and T linked, and linking anti-racist and anti-ableist struggles to trans struggles. So how best to do that? I feel in a way your story kind of exemplifies.
Yeah, and I mean, organised and inclusive socialist politics, I think. Like a lot of people on the British left, was absolutely devastated and kind of destroyed by the 2019 election and its aftermath. But, I still think ethically we were doing absolutely the right thing, if not tactically. So my belief in the need for kind of organised, inclusive, socialist, anti-racist, pro-LGBT and Q politics that thinks about the impacts of austerity, about what happened to people with disabilities in that time, for example, all of these things, and uniting around shared struggles rather than splitting over differences, I think is really important and kind of remains so.
Now that you say it, it seems like of course, yes, yeah, that sounds exactly right. Yeah. So yeah, I guess I kind of want to switch gears a little bit, or maybe just one of the things I said I wanted to talk about was like navigating. You've talked a lot about journalism and publishing and the pivot to fiction, but you also, I know, work in academia, and you've made art, you've been commissioned by arts institutions. Like, would you like to do more with the in the art world, or how do you
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Variations, really, the plan is for that to be the last big trans related book I do. There might be a sort of anthology of 2010s trans writing at some point, but I cannot see myself writing another big trans related book. I can't think what that would be. I mean, the only plausible thing would be like a book about the British media and trans people, but to be honest, both the Memoir and Variations deal with that a lot, and I do not want to immerse myself in that stuff anymore directly because it's horrible. So I don't really think there's another like trans book in there, so I'm not quite sure what the next direction is creatively. I mean, I do really enjoy writing for film and filmmaking, and I definitely want to do that. I actually was just about to start making a new film when lockdown hit last year, in which I would have played the French surrealist bisexual writer René Crevel. And I mean that will still happen at some point, I think, but obviously it's been on hold for some time now. But I'd definitely like to write and make more films. Indeed, I'm going to be working on a big screenplay about a British socialist politician later this year in a residency at the Wising Arts Centre. So that might be more of a direction. I mean, again, I do have to think about making money from writing to some extent, and I think my writing would be quite different if I wasn't having to think at all commercially. I would like to be writing more experimental short fiction. And, Variations, I think, is experimental short fiction in a sense.
And so academic writing, I mean, you've done a little bit of it as well. So, but that obviously doesn't make any money. Like, would you do more?
And I don't enjoy it.
You don't enjoy it?
I realise I don't really enjoy it.
Interesting.
When I loved my master's degree. That was probably the happiest I've been in education in terms of, not so much the environment around it, because actually I did my master's part-time and worked in sort of shops and offices. But intellectually, that was where I was happiest. Master's study had the sort of right mix between sort of breadth and depth for me. I mean, I didn't do a PhD for 10 years, and eventually I wrote Variations as my PhD, or most of Variations, and then writing a critical essay about memoir theory and fiction, which is kind of the bulk of what we've been talking about in this interview. And that was funded, so I didn't have to think about money for 3 years, really. I didn't have to think commercially anyway. I mean, I still made some money from writing, but I didn't have to really think commercially. But I tried to get back into academic writing during the PhD and just really found I didn't like it. I mean, in my mid-20s, I'd had to make a choice between journalism and academia. I was working in an office job in Brighton. My friend used to describe it as the work the computer finds too boring, which I think was generous to the job, if anything. I really, really fucking hated that job. I mean, I left like 14 years ago and I'm still furious about it. It was really shit. I didn't get funding for a PhD, so I thought, well, I can either do this PhD part-time and find a way to pay the fees, but then that's my main thing that I do around work. Or I can pursue something else, like most likely journalism, which I was, doing quite a lot of freelance journalism at the time for these little film magazines earlier. And I decided to pursue journalism. And so I found a lot with my journalism at that point that people would reject my work because it was too academic. And then when I got back to academia in the mid-2010s, I had this real problem with my academic writing being too journalistic. But, I didn't like, with academia, I like the fact that you can delve very deeply into a subject and very intelligently. I don't really like the conventions of academic writing. I don't like having to reference everything, actually. I'm always kind of remembering interesting things and not being able to remember where it's from, which is a bit of a problem because, one of the things about the internet now is you have to sort of reference everything. I'm very fond of quoting Engels, saying that, and you'll like this, there's an Engels line somewhere, I can't remember where he says, every Englishman, without exception, becomes patriotic on meeting an American. Oh. And I think that's a really astute observation now, as it was in, the 1860s or whenever. But I've no idea where he said that or where I read it. And so, if I quote it anywhere, I have to vouch for it.
Right.
And in journalism...
And I liked your Napoleon quote. What was it? Why attribute to malice that which can be adequately explained by incompetence?
Yeah. I mean, that one is a bit easier to reference. I mean, that one's a bit more kind of in the culture. But I've tried recently to find this Engels quote again because I mentioned it a couple of times on Twitter. And I thought I'm going to have to stop using it because I don't know where it's from.
Right.
And I can't find it. So listeners, if you know, please do write to us. Oriana and I will both be very grateful for the origin of that particular insight. But that didn't work for me, and I didn't like the fact that I got very used to having a readership. I mean, I don't know how much for readership, but the feeling that with the journalism I did, that people were reading, and it was maybe making a difference to people.
Yeah. On that note, I also would love to have a readership, or in this case, a listenership. So we do really want to hear from you, not only to find out the origin of that Engels quote, if you know it, but also just to let me know if you're enjoying the series. You can do that by emailing me. My email is studio@orianafox.com, or you can support the series via my Patreon, patreon.com/OrianaFox. So I'm just going to take a pause in the conversation with Juliet Jacques. As you've heard, we've spoken about her new book, Variations, which is now published this past week. You can now get yourself a copy, so do go out and do that. Links are provided in the show notes.
Next time on Multiple O's.
My discussion with Juliet Jacques continues in part 2, you'll be pleased to know, where we'll be speaking in depth about her film, You Will Be Free. So stay tuned.
Oh.
Thank you so much for listening. See you in part 2.
oh 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 oh